This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello and welcome to the Pink Talks, the show where we discuss human rights and all things intersectional. I'm Mariam Shanava, and hosting with me today we have Ana Gaderina Caldera. In today's episode, we will talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls with Annita Lucchesi, the founder of Sovereign Bodies Institute. Outside of her role at SBI, Anita is pursuing a Ph.D. at the University of Arizona School of Geography, Development and Environment, and she is a graduate scholar at University of Arizona's Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. Now let's get started. Hi, Anita. Thank you so much for joining us and for agreeing to speak with us about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This is a very important and sensitive issue that has deeply affected communities across North America. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the gravity of this situation uh, uh, and the importance of listening to the experiences and perspectives of those affected by it. My intention for this interview is to learn from your insights. I think it will be helpful to start with the history and context of violence. So, can you tell us how colonialism has affected or impacted the violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals in Canada and in the United States?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Um, I think I would start just by saying that. So my people, I'm Cheyenne. My people have a proverb that says that a nation is not defeated until the hearts of its women are on the ground, and I think that really puts the gender violence that Native women and girls and Two Spirit folks experienced in context. If you're trying to wage genocide against a people and trying to force them into submission, the best way to do that is to uh, beat down their women, and our Two Spirit people and our sense of community fabric, which is, woven through our women and Two Spirit relatives. And so attacking us was a way to attack our peoples and our future all at once. And so violence against Native women and Two Spirit people became part of the daily practice of colonialism, and continues through to this day. I live in Southeast Montana, which still has a kind of Wild West mentality, that a lot of people are proud of. We still have a lot of cowboys around here, a lot of ranchers, and it's still very isolated and rural in a lot of places. Um, but non-native people take that Wild West mentality to extremes, and it teaches them that, and they've learned this across generations, that they can harm native people, especially native women and Two-Spirit people, and get away with it. And it's part of, the culture here, you could say, not our native culture, but this Wild West culture that we still live in.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this impact of this colonialism on indigenous communities. It's clear that addressing the root causes of this issue requires recognition of historical injustice and commitment to decolonization of indigenous self-determination. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what are some of the systematical barriers that prevent effective responses on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And how can these barriers be addressed?
Well, I think the biggest one is law enforcement negligence and complicity. I've been in this movement for almost 10 years and worked with hundreds of families across the US and Canada. And the only thing that every case that I've worked on had in common was law enforcement negligence. Investigations not happening the way they should, evidence not being logged, sometimes police being directly involved in the violence. Um, it's it's hard. I know that we like to think of bad police, bad cops as like bad apples, but they're not a bad apple if the entire system is designed to facilitate that bad behavior. They're a symptom of the problem, not, a bad apple to get rid of. And that's truly what I see. And also the lack of sovereignty and self-determination that we have as sovereign nations. We should have, we do have the right to protect our citizens from harm and from violence, and to hold people accountable when they do inflict violence against our citizens. But unfortunately, the American legal system and the Canadian legal system, they don't allow for that. Here in my community, we're policed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency, and any major crime, which would include murder or human trafficking, any crime like that is prosecuted by the federal government. So we, as a tribe, have no power over the investigation or what happens to the perpetrator, what the court process looks like. We're really still being held hostage by a colonial system that was not designed to keep us safe. And beyond that, I think another big barrier that I see is that the system so often does not recognize missing and murdered Indigenous people for who we are and what happened to us, in the sense that there's so much ongoing debate on what makes a person Indigenous, or what makes a person a woman, or what case is considered a murder versus, suicide or hypothermia or things like that, that they use those semantics to dramatically undercount the number of cases and to not have to do a meaningful investigation. And an example of that I'll share real quick is that one of the most common things that we see here in Montana, but also other areas of the plains, is that women and girls will be found. Oh gosh, there's my dogs. Okay. Women and girls will be found frozen to death. And the case will be medical examiners will classify it as hypothermia because that was their true cause of death. But the manner of death is still undetermined. So just because they froze to death doesn't mean someone didn't leave them out there to die, and deny them medical care or purposely leave them out there to die. There's still a potential crime that took place. But when law enforcement get that ruling that it's hypothermia, it's easy for them to just say, oh, there was no murder. It was an accident. It was hypothermia. It was their fault. And then they don't investigate. So those semantics are, in a colonial system, very important and prevent justice from occurring quite a bit.
Yes, it's kind of like strange because so many out of missing, like they are minorities, and out of the missing people, they are majority. I think like out of 90% of the missing people who's investigating gets butchered is like Indigenous women and girls. Like I was reading about it, and it's like kind of shocking statistics. My question, like you kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but I want to kind of ask more specific question. How do you think gender-based violence intersects with other forms of oppression, such as racism in the experience of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals?
Well, as a survivor myself, I can speak to my own experience. I've had multiple experiences of violence in my life, and some of them by non-native men, some of them by native men. But in both instances, I think the root was colonialism. Some of my experiences with non-native men were very racialized. So, being called Pocahontas, even though I look nothing like Pocahontas at all. You can't see me because this is a podcast, but you can Google me and see that I look nothing like the Disney version of Pocahontas. But, so things like that, or like I remember going to a concert with a friend of mine who's also a Native woman, and we were walking down the street, and because it was late, we decided to get a hotel room that night so that we didn't drive home super tired. And a non-native man followed us down the street and kept trying to buy us because he assumed we were prostitutes because we were native. So I've had a lot of experiences like that. On the flip side, my experiences with native men have also been, I think, deeply rooted in their version or their experience of colonialism and the violence they experienced as children, the dysfunction they grew up with in the home, the lack of healing or mental health resources for our people, the intergenerational trauma, the trauma of boarding schools. There's a lot. There's a lot there for Native people to unpack and heal from, and if you don't have resources to do it or role models to show you how, it can feel pretty impossible. And that's definitely what led to, the native men that harmed me were all self-medicating with substances and really struggling with severe mental health issues that there was just no resources for. And that doesn't excuse the violence that they perpetrated, but it's context that helps us understand it a little bit more. So that's kind of my way of explaining, because people ask me this question a lot, and I think expect that the violence is only done by non-native men. And I will say that over half of the cases we've documented are perpetrated by non-native men. So it is a significant portion. But also, our own people are struggling to find ways to relate to each other, because we're all like, I had a conversation with a friend of mine last night who's a native man, and we were talking about this, and his family has been touched by this crisis as well. And, we talked about how in native communities, it's safer to assume when you meet a new person, it's safer to assume that they are a survivor than to assume that they're not, because that's how many of our people have experienced violence. And we're all still trying to figure out how to navigate that, while also living in an environment where we're still targeted and very unsafe.
Yeah, it's really complex, this issue, but yes, the thing that you said that touched me the most, it doesn't excuse the violence but explains. I think it's like the cornerstone of it. So it's representative of the system. It's a symptom of the system. This issue is so complex and multifaceted that it does require a comprehensive and collaborative responses. Can we hear your thoughts on how media coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls impact public perception on the issue, and what are the steps that can be taken to improve it from your point of view? Because I believe that if we were talking with the non-native people, they would have some ideas around the subject, but it's from always from the outside. So can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
I think a lot of the narrative in the media, like the two, there's kind of two parallel narratives that I see. One of them is that it's our fault, right? Like we're leading a quote high risk lifestyle, and that it's our fault because we're criminals or sex workers or addicts, or we're just too dysfunctional. Like our communities can't function, and so we're just dying. That's one narrative. And then the other is that Native women are kind of like rabbits in hats that just disappear magically. Like people get really interested in kind of a voyeuristic way around like Native women are going missing. No one knows why. That's not true. We all know why. Any Native person you can ask on the street, they could give you 10 reasons why. But the mystery of it is what's appealing to non-Native audiences, not the human rights crisis, the kind of like pleasure that they get from a mystery. And I think both of those narratives are really harmful. I think it's starting to change, but slowly. There was a case of a young woman in Canada this last week who her body was found in a dumpster, and she was the fourth Indigenous woman found in the landfill in Winnipeg in the last, I think, 6 months, and they haven't located the bodies of the other three women. The city didn't want to pay the cost to search the landfill, but this fourth one, her name was Linda. The medical examiner decided, and the police decided, that there was no evidence of any foul play, and that she crawled into the dumpster herself and just died, which seems horrific and awful and unjust and ridiculous to the rest of us, but that's still the way the system operates. And a lot of the media coverage, just kind of left it there as a fact and didn't question it. And even the media coverage that was more humanizing and said, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, it's still pushing a narrative, not just to non-Native people, but to Natives too, that it's normal for us to crawl into a dumpster and just die, when it's not. So that's where we're at with the media. I think the other piece is the media can be very exploitative of this crisis. Families go through hell. Families go through so much, and survivors as well. And myself as a survivor, I've had media really do exploitative, wrong things with my story without my consent, and it's very violating and harmful all over again. And a lot of the media coverage on this issue is not aligned with the needs and priorities of families. Families aren't in leadership through the process, and it produces things that are inaccurate, harmful, and definitely not helpful. So what I always recommend, and where I hope the future of media coverage on this issue goes, is that families are empowered to be in leadership in all steps of the process. Even for longer form projects like documentaries, there should be an advisory board of families with veto power, to decide what's in there and what's not, and how to portray their loved ones' cases and how to portray the issue. I haven't seen that done yet, but I do think it's possible.
That's so interesting. Also, when you mentioned earlier in the earlier answer that somebody referred you as Pocahontas, I read that there is something called Pocahontas syndrome, in the minds of non-native, non-natives, and it often creates the violence. And this is why the overwhelming majority of perpetrators who commit crimes of sexual violence against Indigenous women are non-Indigenous individuals, because of how media portrays them. And I wanted to know a little bit more about some strategies or interventions that have been developed to address the crisis, by the government or even by communities.
Yeah, so the Canadian government had a national inquiry into the issue, and there was hundreds of recommendations made, and as far as I know, or calls to action. As far as I know, none or very few of them have been implemented in the years since those calls to action were made. Here in the States, we have the Not Invisible Act Commission, which is kind of a smaller version of a national inquiry, and that's still ongoing. I don't know how that process will turn out. Outside of kind of government inquiries into the matter, I do think that the most effective work to address this issue has been done by grassroots community members. For example, our communities are starting to build our own volunteer search and rescue teams, or there's advocates all over the country, most of us survivors and family members ourselves, providing direct services to families and survivors, Our organization, we have a search that we're going to do tomorrow, and later today I'm helping a survivor report to law enforcement. Those are resources that the government should be providing, but they don't. So our people have stepped up to fill that gap. There's still a lot of gaps to fill, and we're doing it, I think, the best we can with very limited resources. But I think we are doing it well.
It's a as the so civil society is basically doing the job that government should be doing, basically. Yeah. In that view, from your point of view, what are the do you have an idea of the major policies and practices that should be put in place to prevent this kind of violence from the part of the government and government institutions?
Well, I think there's a lot of different steps that need to be taken. It's hard to boil it down to even just 2 to 3. One that I will call out is that the Indian Child Welfare Act is currently under attack at the Supreme Court here in the States. It's a court case called Brackeen v. Holland, and the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, is designed to keep Native children in Native communities. So when they're removed from their parents due to neglect or abuse, the first priority should be to place them with other extended family that is safe for them. And if none is available, then to place them in a foster home in their tribal community. And then if that's not available, at least a foster home that is a native home, so that they have a better chance at safety and connection to culture and community. Quite a few of the cases I've worked on were adults that were in the foster care system as kids, and were abused physically, sexually, emotionally, and also withheld from their biological family and their culture, which led to mental health issues that unresolved put them or made them a target for violence later on in life. So that's one contributing factor to this issue that unfortunately is currently under attack by conservatives in this country, and I think could have really devastating consequences. As an advocate, I see firsthand when Native children go to non-Native foster homes, just how ugly things can get. I work with children that have been trafficked out of group homes. That's quite common, or run away 30 times in a year because they're being abused in that home. And I mean, I even had a conversation with law enforcement recently where they were sharing a story where all these Native kids were running from this group home, and they couldn't figure out why, and they kept catching the kids that were running away and sending them back to the home and didn't ask questions. And I think they said something like 12 of them ran away in a year, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong, so they finally decided to go to the home and see why are they running away. Well, it turned out that they were being severely neglected in that home. They had lice and bugs, bed bugs, and nobody wants to live in a house with lice and bed bugs. Of course, those kids are going to run away. So the system was neglectful and abusive to them for a year. Some of those kids got trafficked while they were on the streets, got sent to juvenile detention facilities because they kept running away. And it was all because the system was neglectful, and they didn't have a connection to family or community anymore because of that removal process. So that's just one facet among many, but it's something I'm really passionate about, is that our kids, our babies belong with our people, and that there are devastating consequences when that central value isn't respected and honored.
Yeah.
Well, do you think, or how do you think that like non-indigenous allies effectively support the work of indigenous communities, and when addressing the issue of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls? Like the way you said how communities work together, is there something that non-indigenous allies can do to help them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's room for everybody in this movement. I do think it needs to be family led, but there's room for everyone to help. And sometimes it's, like we're doing a search tomorrow. I don't like whether you're native or not. I would love to have you show up and help us look. So there's always things like that. One of my favorite stories is there's a non-native woman that lived. She lived here in Montana and um, heard about this issue, and she was a mom with young kids, and she was so upset that like she couldn't imagine like other moms going through this, losing their kids. And it really like lit a fire under her, and so she started calling all of the newspapers in the state every time a new case happened and said, why aren't you covering it, why aren't you covering it? And to the point where one of them said like, okay lady, you're kind of harassing us. And she said like, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom, I can watch Frozen 5 times today, or I can call you 5 times today. And it worked. The biggest newspaper in the state issued a public apology for their lack of coverage, and now years later they still have dedicated coverage on the issue. So that was just her, using the resources that she had, which was time and a phone line, and being stubborn and persistent, and it made a huge difference. So some people belong on the front lines on searches or at marches or things like that. Some people make big differences just from their living room. There really is room for everybody.
Yeah. Um, we are more or less reaching the end of the episode, but we want to ask you if you want to speak about a topic that you think it's important to address that we didn't cover.
I think the thing that I really try to raise awareness on is police violence against Native people. I know we touched on like the negligence piece of it a little bit, but um, part of my job is to help families whose loved ones have been killed by police. And I think there's a growing national and international discussion on police violence against people of color in the United States. Native people are unfortunately mostly erased and left out of that discussion, even though we experience the highest per capita rate of police killings by race. And here, where I live in Southeast Montana, Billings is the nearest city. Billings police kills a Native person every 3 to 6 months. And they, all of them have been ruled justified. The inquest process is an absolute joke. Native people, or Billings police has the second highest rate of police brutality in the country, and the vast majority of their victims are Native. I think it's, or we're disproportionately represented. I think we represent about a third of their victims, and we're 6% of the city population. So very highly represented. And I mean, the last inquest that I went to into a police killing of a Native person in Billings, they it was an all-white jury that decided within 15 minutes that the killing was justified, even though that person was unarmed and wasn't committing a crime. He was working on the engine in his car. So that's the kind of landscape we live in, that it's not just, like creepy predators in the bushes or super racist people that are targeting us. It's the actual people that are paid to keep us safe are killing us and getting away with it over and over and over again. And I hope that as that dialogue on police violence continues, that Native people are able to have more of a space in it.
Well, that has been very insightful. Anita, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us about this crisis, and your insights and perspectives has been invaluable, and I am grateful for the opportunity to listen to you and to learn from you. It is clear that addressing these systematic barriers that perpetuate this crisis requires a comprehensive and collaborative response that centers Indigenous voices and perspectives. And I appreciate your time and willingness to share your thoughts with us. And I hope that this conversation will inspire positive change and will give the people information they need.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Anita, thank you so much once again. It was really a really eye-opening conversation, especially for us that are here from Europe, and we limit ourselves in reading newspapers or books around these subjects to talk to someone who does such a wonderful work with people. It was like a learning experience for us. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for giving this platform to raise awareness on this issue. Just want to add that if anybody wants to learn more about us or our work, our website is sovereign-bodies.org. We are a nonprofit. We do take donations. Our donations go towards providing critical services to MMIP families and Indigenous survivors of violence. Or if you can't donate, just share our work out. That's always appreciated as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team: Ana Catarina Caldeira,
Laura Stafia,
Mariam Shanava,